we're going to work through this in part, but this game in different sequences. Great War, 1914 to 1918. This game is coming out with a reprint from One Small Step Games. Now, for me, this game is something like Hallowed Ground. I picked this up very early in my gaming years, after having picked up SPI's World War I, which is a superior game, but this covers it at a different level. And many of the same design mechanisms are in play in this. This is just taking a more detailed view of World War I, using some of the same kind of concepts, say, the way the combat result table works. It doesn't simply generate BRP losses or whatever. In this game, they're NRCs. But it has that effect. But the most important thing is throwing more troops in doesn't necessarily, it gets you better odds, but that's not necessarily what you want to do. You have to study the chart. You have to consider what your strategic situation is as to how much you want to throw more troops into the game, into a particular battle. As I said, this game is being reprinted. Now, the original that we're going to look at here, I believe, has some significant flaws in it. The naval system can seriously unbalance what's going on. Even without that, the way Russia is handled in it ends up rather odd, with the Russian front being easily collapsed, but the collapse of Russia not really being generated by the occurrences there. But you can drive Russia into basically being a waste case in this game if you follow what I feel is the general strategy in most World War I games, which is kill Russia. Pummel Russia as much as you can. Well, you can drive Russia into being useless long before the revolution in this one. But it's very, very hard to get anywhere on the West Front even so, which works out all right. There are a number of optional rules in this, and the core rules aren't exactly short either for this time period. This is, the whole rules. I don't have page numbers on here, unfortunately, but it's a good sized pack of rules here. I actually have 2 copies of the rule book. I don't know if the game came with that in general or if I was just lucky, and then some additional rules which are available. These are online at Grognerd, WebGrognerds, Grognerd.com, and they're also cross-referenced over on Board Game Geek. Okay, so as you can see, it's an area-based game. The units are generally army size units. They have simple movement and combat factor, but what's kind of neat is on the other side, they have their entrenched version, which is going to have an attack, a defense, and a movement factor. If you compare the two, you'll see the attack is half, the defense is twice, and the movement is half. So there will come a time fairly soon in the game where you move from that more mobile early stage of the war to a more static stage, and then if we get really far in the war, we have mechanized units essentially, which don't entrench, but they have some additional rules, kind of like the tanks do in the old World War I. I haven't really looked over the rules, so you're going to have to kind of bear with me. I'm going to try to go over them more of a gloss level than the full details, because unfortunately I tried to read them and realize I know most of these. This is, for me, this was really sat in the place that La Grande Guerre does nowadays in that time period, just as the game I wanted to have work for World War I, a period I love to look at. Yet it never quite did, but it covered enough and got enough detail that it was able to really grasp my interest. Now, I haven't looked at it for a long time, but so much of it is familiar that it was really hard to actually read the rules. Let's take a look at what the sequence of play is going to look like. So each turn is a month, and we have the entire year and the entire war and then some covered in here in case it extends longer. And you open up by generating how many resource points you have, and you get this every month. So instead of the quarterly turns in World War I, you have a little bit more detail there. And the points that you get, you can mobilize new units with. And there's a, I don't remember what the cost is. It's over here. There's a whole overall listing of all the different costs of different things. So mobilizing an army, that's amphibious landings. Mobilizing an army is going to cost you only 2 resources. It's more expensive to do an amphibious landing or evacuation than it is to actually build the unit, which makes sense when you consider, armies were able to be raised up fairly easily. Now you have to be careful because your armies actually are a limited resource. You usually lose them and they go to your force pool, but there are conditions under which you lose them and you can never rebuild them. Again, kind of like World War I, the SPI game. Then we're going to handle a naval operations phase where you can pay points to activate your navies. Let's see, it costs 1 to exit a port. Try to see what it costs to move. That's grants. I don't think it costs you to actually move in your combat, but the naval combat results table is going to be actually, yeah, this is in NCRs. This is a result based on the strength of the forces involved. This is very dangerous to the Brits. They really can't allow the Central Powers to have access to the sea, but the alternative, which is to have their navy either they have a choice of either losing it to being sunk or losing their entire, economic capability, and then maybe having ships sunk as well. It puts them in a much, much riskier position because Britain cannot afford to allow the Germans to really extend the war into Great Britain itself. And it is quite possible in this game in a way that it's not possible in most World War I games. Ground movement itself, now I seem to remember that had a cost too, but maybe it's attacks that do. Strategic movement has a cost. Yeah, okay, ground movement itself doesn't have a cost, but any kind of attack, unless it's strategic, any kind of attacks do. In which case you have to pay based on the type of attack. Now, assault is the most simple attack, and that's what's available at the beginning of the war. But as you start getting tank entrenched units, you're able to do attrition attacks, where you pay an amount of points and just cause casualties to the opponent. And that's a really cool designation. The problem is, of course, that your attrition attacks, your odds of doing more damage than you're paying for may not be that good. Then there's these tank infiltration attacks, which you pay extremely high amounts for. You take losses from them, but they have the ability to force the enemy to retreat in a way that doesn't really happen normally. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to talk about the map at all. We'll get to that in a moment. So the ground combat, depending on the type of combat you use, in general, though, you're going to be using this combat results table, and it records losses in terms of a base result, combat result, which is going to be in NRCs, your economic points. But that gets multiplied by the size of the forces involved in the battle. I think the smaller force in armies is the multiplier. There are army and corps-sized units, and actually there's also a couple of divisional-sized marine units. Okay. And then you have to determine your supply, and supply rules are a little iffy here because you have to cope with the area, the way areas interact here. So it's actually possible to trace supply. There are contested regions where both players are going to be present in the area. And you can trace supply through those, but you can't move out of them into areas that you don't already exist in, basically. There are some tricky things that can happen through the supplies. Being out of supply is very bad in this game. I seem to remember you get destroyed eventually and permanently when you're out of supply. Okay. Let's take a look at the map and the representations there. So your average area is just a name of an area, but the facing on the name might be important. Is this the one where that is? No. Okay, the boundaries are important here. You have international boundaries, different area boundaries of different types. So you have normal lines, these strategic obstacles, and then you have operational obstacles, which I have to find when there are less of those over there, over here. Now the normal area boundaries it just cost a movement point to move. However, we have to worry about restricted movement zones, which we'll get to in a bit. Operational obstacles cost an extra movement point to cross, i.e. that's going to cost 2, unless it's winter or spring, in which case they're 2 extra. They also block retreat after combat always, and before combat during winter, but they don't affect supply. And strategic obstacles cost an extra movement point to cross, and 2 extra in spring, i.e. they're not as bad in winter. Oh, no, they are. They cannot be crossed in winter, nor may supply be traced across them in winter. Always block retreats, may not be crossed if an unfriendly ground unit is on the other side. So these strategics are really nasty blocks, and where they are present, you can't even attack the enemy without finding some way around. Those are your serious mountain or, say, the Pripets that you really can't. Here's the Alpine area. You'll notice the Italian Alps, although the Italian-Austrian Alp line, although rather severe itself, is not that kind of restriction because, hey, they did fight through there. They had to if they wanted to fight. Restricted movement zones. There's a 1 movement point cost to leave these areas in addition to any cost to enter an area. And regardless of the cost, you can always retreat before combat, ignoring any weather restrictions but not obstacles. Now, I seem to remember they affect stacking, but that may be the other kind of asterisk. There's 2 kinds of asterisks. These blue ones, which are the restricted movement zones, and then there's another one, which is rare over here, which is non-objective areas. They don't count towards victory points. Units may not be raised and such. They have no NRC production, which means capturing them isn't going to hurt your enemy nor in any way help you. I seem to remember there's a stacking limit in some of those hexes, and we'll have to look that up. So the rules actually aren't all that long. They only go to here. The rest is all scenario rules. Areas indicated by an asterisk may have no more than 3 core, or the equivalent per side occupation in any game turn. Now that's just listed as starred areas. I've always taken that to mean the non-objective area. It's not defined anywhere which is meant. That's just how I've interpreted it, because it made more sense, because there's less wealth there to live off the land or whatever. Okay. We have canals, which you can sail through. For example, here. There's control restrictions on that as well, though. Narrow seas The naval units can cross them, but the adjacent land unit areas have to be under non-enemy control. Ground units may, either friendly or neutral, which means they can't be contested. Ground units may cross such normal movement costs, but both sides must be under friendly control, except retreat before combat. They block retreat after combat. Movement cost to cross is determined by the movement area. We got capitals. I think everybody's only got one. Sometimes Moscow and St. Pete would be both considered a capital, but ports are listed. Basically, that's where the navies can rest. Non-objective areas we've talked about. Increased production area. These are worth 5 victory points and 5 NCRs each for production. And then we have certain sea lane connection letters here. All right. Other things we have on the board, the costs of those sea lane connections. The regular land combat results table is here. A weather table, which indicates, allows you to randomize the weather for every year. Although there are some special rules for the invasion of Russia, I believe, that make sure that it's bad the first year. Your turn record track, along with all the different segments that you have in the sequence of play. And then everybody's got you've got your own charts for the resource credits. Note, the miners do not have their own resources on this. They're going to be handled by a controlling country. So, for example, Serbia's controlling country is Russia. I believe Belgium's is going to be England, although it may be split between England and France. We'll have to see the specifics as we go into it. Anyway, whatever your controlling side is, it determines. It has to pay all your costs and gets all your, production. Although usually these miners are more of a cost than a production gain. All right, we will break for a bit. Okay, let's see what we can catch and whether I can catch some of my mistakes here, because I caught one just now. Any units that are destroyed forever. And I had said only out of supply ones. The reality is, though, you seldom get a unit destroyed. You're usually going to be paying the costs off of the tracks. So if you don't have the money for the tracks. But that's why it's so terrible. You never want to get your tracks down low. But the thing is, like any kind of mechanism in a game, well, you're willing to grind your own economy or whatever down if you're grinding the other guy down worse. And that's one of the factors that takes place in here quite a bit. Okay, let's take a look here. You're able to transfer money between one another and also to minor powers. Now, I thought miners were tracked on their own. Were not tracked on their own. They have no counters for it in the game. But there may be limits to what they can purchase. I'm getting awfully confused here, am I not? There's a charge if you have to transfer a certain number of beyond 5 maritime locations in a row. There's a surcharge if you're shipping through to Russia, which makes each unit cost more, one extra point for each unit that you transfer. Now, that's if you have, if you don't have Gallipoli, Constantinople, Scutari, and Bursa. If you do, then the surcharge is part of the 50% limit. You just don't get an additional surcharge. But no country can give away more than half its money. The U.S. Has what? When it comes in, it's going to have an NCR growth, which again is similar to the World War I situation. Keep an eye out, a possible package coming. Okay. If you take somebody's capital, they lose a quarter of their money, at the end of their immediately next succeeding player turn. If they regain it after that, there's no loss, but if they regain it at some later point, they will not get the lost money back. Okay, so they get like, one turn to get it back. Okay, you're allowed to disband your own formations, and I think you get half the mobilization cost back in your pool. Sometimes this is the best thing to do because the cost of moving something may be greater than the cost of rebuilding it somewhere else. Also, you may want to disband it to give yourself more padding here so that you can take losses. You're able to only do this during your reinforcement or ground combat segments. So you have to be the attacker to take advantage of that ability. But you can take advantage of it to pad your resources so that you're able to fight later. Usually it's better to keep enough resources on hand. You don't want to be doing this very often because you lose half the value that you put into building up units. You can mobilize new units during your reinforcement segment. They take time to come into full game turns for ground units. Naval units, what is it, like a year, I think? Yeah, a year later. There's economic warfare, which I thought it was there. I thought there was a chart. I don't remember how it works. Keep an eye out. You do either restricted or unrestricted for each. Okay. That's stopping at my door. No, there it goes. Okay. The most stressful thing in the world for me is to have someone knock on my door, even if I'm expecting them. My life is without much stress, as you can tell. Okay, so if Britain or Germany is spending on an economic attack, for each 2, they get to roll a die on the economic warfare table. Now, I swear there's got to be one somewhere. Maybe it's on the inner page. My rules are so... There it is. Okay. And it's either going to be restricted or unrestricted, and that's how much damage you produce. Now you can see restricted is really not a good payoff. If I pay 2, the best I can do is 2 hits on the opponent in terms of their economy. Unrestricted probably breaks about even. Attacks against the Americans go against their growth for the next turn. British attacks are always restricted, therefore they don't do any. The whole concept of the blockade, forget about it. It doesn't do a damn thing. I'm assuming this is taking the blockade to a further level where you're actually trying to shoot down blockade runners more or whatever. But they did this, so I don't know. Starting in game 4, the campaign game is basically string all the scenarios together, and each scenario has its own special rules, so that gets kind of wanky the way it works. But beginning on situation 4, the Germans can wage unrestricted warfare. They actually can buy it as a technology in the campaign game. And if they do so, the 5th turn of unrestricted economic warfare causes a roll to see if the U.S. enters the game. And if they do, at some later date, they'll start throwing their effort into the war in various different ways. And that's all kind of pre-programmed. Okay, what about the naval rules? Naval movement, you spend naval movement points. You have a value there, 10 points on a ship. You have to get into port at the end of that, I believe. The sea lanes, though, are long-term travel. I don't think they cost you each time for each turn in it. You're able to transport your ground units, including Marines, during naval operations. They must start stacked together in a port. You can transport 1 strength point for each 1 naval strength point. The ground units will move until they reach a port of debarkation. Ground units can be sea transported by any friendly naval units. Ground units in a sea transport may be landed in a port under friendly control or in ports of hitherto neutral countries which have been first occupied by the Marines. Newly disembarked ground units cannot do any movement or landing. There's also amphibious landings, which are going to be more expensive than regular ground transport or transport of ground units. You have to use field units or Marines, so you can't use units that have been converted to entrenchment status. Those will be trench units. You pay the higher cost. You do the amphibious landings before any other sea transport, so you could do a landing, take an unfriendly or neutral port, and then land sea transported units into that port. You cannot land any in any maritime areas adjacent to Hanover or Petersburg. Hanover being here, and then of course St. Petersburg up there. So you're not going to be able to do any kind of really cool naval attacks that just undermine, Germany or Russia completely. And that has to do with the mining and forts in the water there. Units making the amphibious landing have their attack strength halved and must assault any unfriendly ground units. Marine units may not make amphibious landings against major power national territory. You can also sea evacuate. And the Marine units then are really sort of a lighter force meant to take a target of opportunity usually. There's a cost for this, which is fairly high, same as transports, I think, 4 and 2. I'll look it up later when we're playing. When ships are moving, there's a possibility to do a naval interception. Has to be within half the naval movement allowance of the units trying to intercept. Can't intercept in the area adjacent to Hanover. If only one attempt is made to intercept against 2 unfriendly naval units on separate routes, the intercepting player must go for the closest one. If the interception fails, the moving player did not take avoiding action, he can continue his movement. So the mover is going to have an option to try to avoid. That changes the die roll on the interception, which is this little table here. You add 1 for each intercepting unit above the first one. The interceptee can take avoiding action, and that subtracts 1 for the die roll for each naval unit, which he has in the area of interception above 1. However, if the interceptee's avoiding action succeeds, he must immediately return to the last friendly port, so he doesn't get to take his whatever mission he's undergoing, even though he paid for it, right? Naval combat, it's a simple odds table. It's going to give you points, and again, it's going to be multiplied just like ground combat will be. Ground movement, there's 2 types of movement, restricted and regular movement zones, and this is where things get hard. I don't know if the asterisk stacking is supposed to be the restricted movement zone. See, both make sense to me. A lack of resources or a lack of infrastructure for movement makes sense. Both make sense to me as to why you would reduce stacking on either. They're not delineated. Okay, strategic movement. If you choose to do this, you can move units without using your ground unit's movement points, and for each half point NRC expended, you can move a ground unit one area without regard to weather or obstacles. For each one, you can move one ground unit one area in the restricted movement zone without regard to weather or obstacles. Basically, the train transport is the big effect as to the restricted. And, I can buy it either way as to the stacking limitations, and I don't know which way to take. You can't spend more than 10% of your current NRC balance on strategic movement in a game turn. You can take a place only in a major power's national territory, the national territory of another friendly major power, or any areas of any country immediately adjacent to such areas, providing all such areas are under friendly control. So you're not going to be able to, with the Russians, rail all the way through Austria-Hungary, but you could rail into Galicia, assuming that you control it. Strategic movement can't be done if an area is contested with unfriendly ground units. Operational movement is your normal movement. You don't have to pay for this. You just move based on your movement allowance. However, a ground unit may not leave an area which is contested with unfriendly ground units except to enter another adjacent contested area or an adjacent area under friendly control. And this is what prevents the Germans. The Germans can move into here, right? But they can't just walk through into the Champagne. However, if they had forces in the Champagne already, they could move into here and then move through into there. So you got to be kind of careful because the area system is a little different from what other games really handle, but it works okay. We've already talked about the different obstacles to movement. The narrow straits, starred areas. Areas indicated by an asterisk may have no more than 3 stars, 3 core. Now, that asterisk, what choice did they have? But it looks exactly like the asterisk over here for, I can't zoom in. It's over here. Let me put my finger there. That asterisk over there. That's what it looks like, not like this. Now, of course, they couldn't have printed the blue thing in the rule book, so I can't be sure that that's what they mean. To tell you the truth, it makes probably a little bit more sense to go with the blue ones, but I'm going with these because I don't know what they meant. Neither one talks about starred areas or asterisks in terms of either of these. Again, I'm assuming that level of problem will easily be cleared up in the new game. At the very least, we know that they could print these blue stars if that's what they have, and it doesn't look like that's the actual the graphics have changed slightly. It still has the same general feel, but okay. Ground combat. Okay, ground combat's usually optional unless you've just entered an area solely occupied by unfriendly ground units, in which case you must make an attack that turn. And you're able to be in 2 statuses, field status or trench status. If you're in field status, your attack and defense strengths are the same, i.e. this guy has an attack and defense of 6. If you're in trench status, as we talked about over here, you have a lower attack, higher defense, lower movement. It also affects what kind of attacks you can make. You can change status. This is going to cost you 1 point for an army or half a point for a corps, or smaller. And then you get flipped. That's during your, movement phase? Reinforcement phase. You can mobilize in either status if you're allowed those statuses. So there's 4 types of attacks. You may not make any kind of attack unless you have 2 NRCs for each attacking army, or 1 for each corps. You don't spend these just have to be available for you to be allowed to make the attack. You can only make 1 type of attack per area per phase. Only units in supply can attack. An attack is conducted against all the defending units in the area. So there are 4 types of attacks, some of which you're not going to see for a long time. The assault attack, this is what you start with. You can do this with field or trench units, and all you're doing is standard roll on here, both sides take losses, retreats are applicable, blah, blah, blah. The losses will be multiplied by the number of armies present. The attrition attack, only trench units can do this. Now remember, that means they're going to have weak strength. Only in areas that contain friendly trench units at the start of the player turn. It costs you 1 NRC for each army, or a half for each corps or marine. And the combat's resolved as normal, but the attacker takes no combat losses, while the defender takes double combat losses. However, you can ignore retreat results without any penalty as the defender. Well, as either side, actually, because the attacker can be forced to retreat in some cases. Tank infiltration. Only the major power field units may make tank and infiltration attacks, and they're going to have a number associated with their country of these that they can make each turn. There's no specific units for. They can never be made at worse than 1-to-1 odds. Each army participating in the attack pays 2 NRCs, each corps 1. Marines cannot be involved in them. Combat's resolved as normal, but the attacker's combat loss will be half the result indicated. The defender takes normal losses, but gets an automatic retreat result. Trench units can ignore the automatic retreat at the cost of double combat losses, but they cannot ignore if they get an R on top of the retreat inflicted by the tank infiltration attacks. Trench units can also ignore retreats generated from the assaults, and it costs them double the combat results. So, if you get a result of 3-3 during an assault, the attacker takes 3 per army involved. The defender is going to take either 3 in a retreat or 6, more likely, because you don't like to retreat generally. Giving ground out is bad. Okay, now the last of them is the motorized attack. This is really available only after 1918. Only motorized armies can make motorized attacks, and only when permitted by the situation. For each motorized army, 2 major power field armies, or the equivalent in corps, may participate. There's no special cost for making a motorized attack. The combat's done as normal. The attacker takes a normal combat loss, while the defender's losses are doubled and they take a retreat result. This is, obviously the optimal situation. All defending units, regardless of status, must comply with this retreat, and if able, or they take a further suffering of double combat loss if they're not able to retreat. But they can't voluntarily not retreat. So here you're basically doing, a blitz-style attack. At the very end of the war, you start seeing the tank infiltration attacks beginning to move into truly combined arms motorized operations. But not at a level to be reflected in the game. This is if the game goes just a little bit further than the war did. After attacks have been allocated and paid for, but before the dice are rolled, the defender can retreat before combat. They must all do so. They pay 1 NRC for the right to do so, regardless of size. You almost never will see this unless the defender's in a really stupid location where they're going to get choked out. The attacker now controls the area. He doesn't get any refund on the points he spent. Retreat before combat obeys regular movement rules, but trench units may always retreat before combat across normal area boundaries, regardless of weather. You do a combat ratio, roll a die. Let's see. I'm looking for the multiplier here. The combat loss to be incurred is multiplied by the number of armies in the smaller force for both sides. Then if you have a retreat, if at least one half of the defensive combat strength was in form of trench units, you're able to ignore the retreat by taking double losses. If you're unable to retreat, you also take the double losses. And I think that happens even if you're not a trench form unit. You must go to an adjacent friendly controlled area or into an adjacent neutral area for internment by the political rules if unable to retreat after combat otherwise and unwilling to take the double loss. Retreat after combat has to obey terrain and weather, but if you're in a restricted movement zone, you may always retreat across normal area boundaries regardless of season. We're going to take a little break, and we'll come to supply light, not too much more. Supply rules. So the basis of the supply is that you can trace from area to area that you have under your control, but there's some provisions there. Your ground units are in supply if they can trace to an adjacent area that contains your ground units that are in supply. Which means if you're in this kind of situation where these are both contested areas, these guys can, the Germans over here are in supply because they can trace here. Likewise, the French are in supply because they can trace back. That doesn't apply to general supply rules because navies can't use that special little proviso. But almost everything's a ground unit in the game, and the navies generally just sit in ports, and unless they're doing a navy thing, they don't generally try to sit in areas they're going to be out of supply in. So it's pretty unimportant. What happens if you're out of supply is you can no longer use points off the NRCs, which means you have to take your casualties on your units themselves. If they're destroyed, obviously they're going to be out of the game, because anything is out of the game if it's destroyed. They attack and defend at half their defense. At half, they may not attack, and they defend at half their defense combat strength, based on their current status. So if they're entrenched, they have kind of full strength defense, but not full strength entrenched defense. They cannot move except to intern themselves. I don't remember if they can retreat other than to intern themselves. I think probably they follow the same rules there. You may never deliberately move to out of supply, and that's about it. Neutrals, you have the concept of internment here, where you can withdraw into a neutral, and your unit is essentially being held there. You pay 2 NRC violation, and the unit cannot move or attack. It defends at full strength if attacked, and I don't think it's allowed to play in the game again unless that neutral enters the war somehow. Weather, pretty simple. There's a weather track. We've already kind of talked about it. And there are separate weather zones dividing up the map into 3 major areas. I believe you roll a die for each zone. So you could end up with disparate weather, where it's good in one area and not so good in another. Let me see. Let me make sure of that. The player who moves first rolls the die for the weather. No, it's 1 die roll for all the weather zones. Okay, and then we have a bunch of scenarios. Now, each of these has its own special rules, and I'm going to go into them as we kind of enter them. So, for example, in the first one, we already have violation of neutrality costs spent between Germany, Austria, Britain, France, Belgium, Russia, and Serbia. These resource points, I don't know where the miners fit in. I believe that they're tracked with the major power, but there was something earlier that we saw where you could loan money to the miners, which is kind of weird. Economic warfare. Neither side can do economic warfare except as follows. Britain can do restricted on October 14. Germany, beginning on September 1914, they get 3 free restricted economic attacks against Britain each game turn, unless there's 2 naval strength points kept off the map for each such attack permitted. This is going to be the raiders. These German limited economic attacks may be valid each game turn. The British aren't off the map, although through the December 1914 turn, at which point the raiders have all been hunted down no matter what. Turkey, beginning in September, you roll a die to see if Turkey enters the game. Now, if Turkey doesn't enter the game in this area, I think they can't come in a later scenario. So you get this possibility of countries entering the game, but then they're no longer going to have a continued possibility for the rest of the game, right? No, it's each game turn thereafter in Turkey's case. At the start of the game, you make a roll to see if Italy's a central power, which could just happen. Same thing with Romania. These could have major effects on the play of the game if they are. And therefore, there's no balance here, right? I mean, there's no attempt to really make a balanced tournament game, although there is this advanced tournament options, but these generally are not really tournament rules. They're back in that day, tournament generally meant let's make the game as complicated as possible, rather than let's streamline it as much as possible for tournament play. Belgium, there's a possibility that Belgium starts out the game neutral. This is an option. And I'll probably make a die roll to see if I play with that. It's not in here. The German Mediterranean Squadron, instead of starting in Albania at the start of the turn, place a German 410 naval unit. The Gibbon and her escort were scheduled to be replaced. Again, an option. I may give like this a 1 in 6 chance or something to take place. Only Britain can do amphibious landings during 1914. Technology is going to be field status only, assault attacks only. Limited economic attacks noted up above. 25% of your NRC. Territories are pretty much the full national territory, and that is it. Luxembourg is part of Belgium. Montenegro is part of Serbia for the purposes of the game. Now, in the next period, we see a new boost in resources that comes into play. And let me see. I think the reinforcement phase, I think I implied that you get more points then, and that is, I don't believe the case. I believe you get those points at the beginning of this scenario. Let's take a look at the campaign game rules. If I can find them. Is that in the optional? That's errata. Somewhere I've got the rules for linking it all together. And I am not seeing that. Is that this? Here we go. Okay, so it starts in 1914. We start with the starting forces. Mobilization's normal. We take the notes as we enter into each of the situation games, as I said. Now, at the end of each December and June turn, the NRC growth period occurs, except for USA. Each power calculates the areas which it's gained control of since its last growth period. These areas may include areas of that power's national territory that they maybe didn't have control over in an earlier period. You deduct from the total of areas gained any NRC production areas lost, i.e. you're going to keep a running total of the value that they're worth. The resultant adjusted figure of gained areas, each major power adds its current NRC balance. So if you save money, you get to add that to basically your total value. The sum of the areas gained, lost, and a major power's balance is then added to that player's last NRC production figure. So any areas you gain or lose are going to be part of your production value. They get factored back in. You can count that right off the map. What you can't count off the map directly is how much money you saved. And you get 100% of that reinvested into your next turn's NRC values. And you can see that that's going to actually skew the game. The game is going to take off, and values are going to end up different significantly from what they show up here. So for example, the first scenario, Germany has $50. 6 turns later, in January, they make an assessment, and basically every 6 months you're going to be making these assessments. Well, 5 turns later, you're going to make these assessments in value. Now here they've gained 14. Some of that's going to be territory gained in terms of advances into Belgium or Russia. Some of that's going to be money they saved up. Well, what we'll see is that those values may diverge quite significantly, especially in the case of poor Russia. So Russia here goes from 30 to 40 to 45. Yeah, what we're going to see is Russia go from like 30 to 20 to 6 to nothing. They're going to be at negative money. They're going to have no money for the game. The reason for that is Russia has a lot of territory that's got some value, and they lose a lot of it. They've got more than 30 points of territory that can be lost. These countries, the economic value of the countries is not just a count up what's on the map. It's a differential from, so as a quick example, Germany worth 50. They're not worth 50. They're worth 1, 2, 7, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. They're close. I may have missed one. They may be 50. But Russia is not 50. Now, or is not 30. Now, it's possible that Russia is 30 if you reverse the two kinds of asterisks, but that's very clearly here that these are non-objective hexes and not these. So I don't think that's what's intended, but Russia has more than 30 territories. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That one wouldn't count. 6, make it 11 for this area, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 21, So you can see if you lose about half of Russia, they're not going to have any income whatsoever. And that's a situation that happens very quickly, because they lose territory at a great rate in this game, I found. We shall see. Okay. Technology. Technological portion of each situation is going to be ignored in the campaign game. Instead, you start with field status and assault attacks. All other types of units and attacks, including economic attacks, have to be purchased with NRCs. And you have a cost for buying the different technologies here, and I believe you're allowed to do this only, I don't know. Yeah, I think you can do it during your turn. Yeah, during your reinforcement segment. So you could buy it earlier in the game than it would normally be there. Of course, that's money you're spending out of your reserves for the next turn, which would get added to your overall income. So you might not want to do that. Trench status is not allowed before December 1914, though. And then you have these others. For example, this will be allowed 5 turns after you have trench status. You'll be allowed to buy attrition attacks. So there's going to be a little bit of bookkeeping on that. I noticed some things in the errata that maybe are a little different from how I spelled them out. So like capitals, the NRC loss is a half, not a quarter. So you may see that I find some things that are a little, that while I'm playing, I'll turn out different from how I gave you the rules. But I think I gave a fair overview, especially early on, and then a little bit more detail following up on the major systems in the game. And we'll get to see how this plays. And I really like how it plays. What I don't like is the overall results that I get from it. But I like how it plays enough, and this is very much like La Grande Guerre here. I like how it plays enough that this game totally charmed me and won me over for many a year. It was my favorite World War I game, although nowadays La Grande Guerre gives me more and causes more headaches than this does and causes more ridiculous results. And SPI's World War I is, for something a little smaller, a richer, a better game, as well as probably at least as good a simulation. However, this is a good competitor to put up against something like Paths of Glory, which is bigger than World War I and small and much, much smaller than La Grande Guerre. This is probably a little bigger than Paths of Glory, but man, it's so much better. Just, not as a game, but in terms of just giving you the details and an understanding of what's going on, it is just so much more up my alley than Paths of Glory is. And you'll get to see it. Like I said, this thing's a treasure for me, and I'm really kind of happy to see it getting a reprint. Maybe I think it's a design that could definitely, with a little bit of fixing, could probably really shine even today, and we'll see why.